Born in Charlottesville, Virginia, Fountain Hughes was immediately pushed into slavery. Working for B until he was freed, Fountain endured many of the hardships of slavery. However, because slavery was all Fountain ever knew, he mentioned the way he was treated in his interview positively.
Boys they had a good time. The masters didn't treat them bad.
With that in mind, there was still much that Fountain Hughes dealt with. One hardship were the so-called slave passes. These passes were written by the slave masters to send their slaves to do errands. Without a pass, the slave wasn't allowed off the plantation. If a slave was to be spotted off of the plantation without a pass, they would risk capture and torturous behavior from others. And though these passes may have been easily exploited for escape, they were still difficult to deal with and left slaves without any independence or freedom. Fountain mentions,
"Well, I couldn't go to nobody's house without I have a note or something from my master. And if I had that pass, that was what we call a pass. If I had that pass, I could go wherever he sent me."
Another difficulty that Fountain and other slaves faced were the meals. As slaves, they were fed very low-quality, starchy, fatty foods. Some foods they were fed included cornmeal, lard, molasses, some meats, beans, and etc. Additionally, these foods were often distributed weekly, leading to rotting or perishing of the food. This led to slaves being often starved and overworked. However, though Fountain faced many hardships, more were to come during and after Reconstruction. During Reconstruction, family matters were an issue for Mr. Hughes and other slaves alike. In Fountain's case, his father was killed during the war, and his mother separated at an unknown time, leaving him and his brother to survive alone. Him and his brother were often forced to rely on others, which led to problems. Because they lived in Virginia, many white Southerners weren't willing to help them. So, they decided to stay in a livery stable that a friend owned. They slept in cars and were often scared to venture out. Though this was sad, it was nowhere nearly as detrimental as some other consequences that slavery had on the freedmen. Because slaves weren't permitted to learn to read or write, they had very little job opportunity after they became freedmen. Though the Freedmen's Bureau existed and slaves had a chance to get education through them, the Bureau fell apart, leaving freedmen alone. This meant that the freedmen were left to work in jobs mainly in the field of manual labor, if not on plantations. This included Fountain Hughes. After he moved to Delaware, he worked for a man named Mr. R, where he would pull manure carts for him. He made money and created a happy life for himself. And though he may have had a happy life, the situation was very different for every freedman. Yes, Reconstruction may have been effective for Fountain, but it was not effective for all freedmen. Overall, Reconstruction was a failure, as many freedmen were without jobs and such. However, despite its failures, Fountain got lucky and made a good life for himself. He lived out his final days in happiness, preaching to other African Americans and making what he could of life. He was a great, prosperous man.